Black like me. Black like me. Black like me.
You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G., a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Here's Dr. G.
Hey, good people. I want to welcome you back to another exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. I'm excited about season 9. Is that black enough for you? We're going to have some great conversations this season. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. We've stepped away for a little bit, so we've got to bring you up to speed with what's happening in my world, your world, our world. So we just want to just keep things moving by having these great conversations. So if you've been following me for a while, you know that I've referenced this article that I wrote for Cap Times in 2013 that really created a wave in our community, a movement within my nonprofit, and it's become a thing. In fact, it's a thing that we are going to be commemorating in our organization and in our community. That has been 10 years since I wrote that op-ed piece in December of 2013. And so I have some of my co-conspirators here in the studio with me, and these are gentlemen who I sat with probably August of 2013 to talk about my need to get some things off my chest. I'll get into that just a little bit, but let me just let you know who I have here with me who will just help me talk about this commemorative part of this season where I'm just reflecting back on what prompted that article, what I experienced, what I think the community experienced, what I see, what I didn't see, what I haven't seen. And so this is just going to be enjoyable just to take this journey with me. I have Paul Fanlund here, who is Cap Times publisher. And we've worked together closely for the past 10 years on a number of things. But he's here in the studio with me. And also Phil Halsinger, who is a retired journalist, a redeployed pastor. I think he's been retired twice, and he might be on his second or third tour. And he is the gentleman who introduced me to Paul Fanlund 10 years ago. So let me just pause right now and to say, Paul, Phil, welcome to Black Like Me. It's really great to have you both here.
Thanks. It's good to be here. Been listening to this for a bunch of years. It's fun to be here in person.
It's terrific to be with you again, Alex.
So, it's always fun to turn the tables. It's like when the pastor becomes the parishioner, the doctor becomes the patient, the journalist become the guest. And so I get to control this black mic because it's my damn studio and I get to ask questions. But no, it's been such a wild ride. And I just have to be honest, Paul, I can't believe that this has been 10 years. I can't believe that we're looking back on something that came out 10 years. And I know that Nehemiah is doing some things and Cap Times is going to do some wonderful things in reflecting on this. But it feels cool. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that we're still in relationship even after this broke 10 years ago. So glad that you can be here as a guest.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And it was Phil, as you point out, who introduced us. And I can't think of anything in the Cap Times that we've done that's quite like this. Really having our front page be an essay like yours with the impact of justified anger. It was distinctive and pretty much unique. And we're still very proud of having been part of it 10 years ago and ever since.
I'm going to come back to how that initial meeting, but since you brought that up, Paul, it just helps me to think about some questions I have. Help us to understand what was so unusual about that front page essay, and also let's just talk a little bit about the timeliness of that from your perspective.
Sure. I think the Capital Times, years before that, as Phil knows because he spent many years on the Capital Times and retired as managing editor to go into the clergy, was a daily newspaper, was a daily print newspaper. And by the time this article appeared, we had morphed into being mostly digital with a weekly tabloid. And we may have had a couple other examples over time, excerpting books or whatever, where we turned our front page over to this kind of essay. So it was really unusual. And I still recall the three of us having coffee in a coffee shop up the street a few minutes from here. And I was just so struck by the anecdotes you told about your personal experiences. And I got to thinking about it and was so moved by it that I was thinking that I was initially thinking of it as an op-ed piece or a column I would write or in some other form, and thought that there's so much depth and timeliness to this that let's go much bigger. And that's what resulted in us essentially turning the cover over and running the long Justified Anger piece that December.
Oh, wow. Now, Phil, do you remember what led to the discussion between the three of us? I reached out to you.
I absolutely remember.
What do you remember about what was going on with me 10 years ago?
You called me. At that point, I was pastor at Memorial United Church of Christ in Fitchburg.
Mm-hmm.
You live in Fitchburg. We'd known each other for a while. You called and said, I've got some stuff I just need to say and help me figure out how I can do this and where can I take it to. And the essay begins with a story of you being at the Rotary and talking about some of the challenges in the community, and afterwards someone coming up to you and saying, I'm just glad you're not an angry black man. And you cleaned up the response for the article, as I recall.
I cleaned it up a lot.
But that was sort of what set it off. And so we sat down and talked about possibilities and said, maybe the Cap Times would be interested. So you and Paul and I had coffee one morning, and indeed the Cap Times was interested in it. I think the Cap Times it's helped transform the Cap Times as well as helped transform the community. I think it's had both impacts.
See, you both are good journalists because you're reading my notes over here. So we're going to come back to how we met, but in what ways do you think it's changed the Cap Times? That's actually one of my questions right here. In what ways did the article help Cap Times or change it?
Well, I think Paul may have some insights into that since he's on the inside. But the Cap Times historically has always paid attention to issues around race and civil rights and such. So, but I think as with all media, it's a predominantly white organization. And so there's sometimes less awareness of thoughts that are going on within the Black or Latino or Asian communities in town. This really brought the Cap Times staff into paying more attention to those issues and thinking about ways to help communicate that to its readers. You helped set that in motion with this article. It was not the first time.
Sure.
But it was the most recent time, and I think Paul can speak more to the
Sure. I'd love to hear Paul's take on that.
Well, Phil did a great job of capturing that dynamic of us paying even more attention to these issues. I think that I was really personally moved by the conversation at the coffee shop and by all that happened after that. It set off, the articles, set off a series of events after that, which included a huge event at the
Expo?
Lion Energy Center.
That's right.
And we also convened here, and a bunch of our journalists sat around the room outside the inner circle where there was a wonderful conversation among African Americans that day. So it rippled through and had effects on us in many ways in the time since. Phil mentions that the Capital Times in its 106-year history has a long record of being trying to be attentive to racial and social justice in the community. But that's not easy for us. And over the years, you and I have had conversations when we've developed a relationship in which you can be absolutely blunt with me, and that's welcome because I really a lot of things you've said have resonated over time. And I think it's had a huge impact. I guess there's another element to it is that our founder, William T. Evu, has been dead for 53 years, but when he died, he created a foundation, a philanthropic arm of the Capital Times. And so I'm on that board as well. And Justified Anger, I think, was a linchpin to me, to a greater awareness I had. So, for example, in about 3 years ago, I'm missing the exact date during the George Floyd conversations and unrest. The Evu Foundation decided to do specific grants to target organizations that might not otherwise have grant writers, may not have sophisticated
That's right.
organizational capabilities to apply for grants, and we gave grants through that period in a way we might not have had justified anger not occurred, and that was also a tangible outcome of this. So it has all sorts of direct and indirect influences on the Capital Times, both the newsroom and the overall organization.
That's really interesting. I appreciate you both sharing that. Phil, I remember you threw out a couple of local newspapers, but you sort of course corrected and you said, but they're not going to let you write it. And I remember thinking, I said I wanted to get it off my chest. I didn't want to write anything. I wanted to talk to someone and have them write it. But there was something about what I was saying that you picked up on that you really felt that I needed to pin it. And I remember you saying, let me talk to one of my colleagues at the Cap Times, because I think of all the newspapers that are here locally, I think that they may be the one that's most open to having you actually write this yourself. At that point, I sort of felt like Jerry Maguire and felt like, no. This is just an idea. Jerry Maguire said, this is just a memo. I was like, no, it's just an idea. I don't want to write it. I just want to get some things off my chest. I want to talk about it. So sitting down with you and Paul was very daunting, because Paul looked very serious. And Paul's looking serious now. He's laughing at, but Paul looked very serious. His arms were folded like they are now. And he wasn't really looking at me as I was talking about this article. I don't think Paul was tracking. I don't think Paul. But when I said, I called the police and I said, my name is Alex G. I'm 50. I'm black. I drive an Acura as black. And I gave my license plate. I remember Paul looking at me and saying, wait a minute. You describe yourself when you call the police? And I said, yeah, don't you? And he said, no. And again, this is my memory. I might be recreating things, but it seemed like at that point, Paul said, you know what? I want you to write an article, 3,000 words. We're going to put some artwork with it. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know that meant like a cover. I just thought it meant, they're going to find some animation or something. But but I realized you were tracking, Paul, and you were listening. But I think when I went down that road, that made it clear to you that my experience of how I live out my life as a professional male in this community who's black is completely different from yours, because you couldn't fathom that I describe myself when I call the police, because it's sort of in my upbringing. You don't put your hands in your pocket. You keep your hands attended to. You describe yourself so that you're not mistaken for anyone. But for me, it felt like that was the turning moment, and it seems like there's been this connection and this dialogue ever since.
Well, and I think that notion that, maybe somebody could just interview you and they could tell your story could have happened. They would have. Sure. You had some really good anecdotes in that article, but you brought a lot more to the article than just the anecdotes. You brought the emotions you were feeling. You also brought a vision of what could be, of how the community could change in response to this. That would not have happened if it was just, let's interview Pastor Alex and we'll see what he has to say.
That's true, and that was great insight. And often when we talk about the partnership between Cap Times and Nehemiah and the creation of Justified Anger, your piece is not always told. That's why it's very important to me that you be here to tell that part as well, because I knew that I could talk with you as a colleague who was also a pastor who could understand the angst of what I was feeling. I think I didn't know how much that comment bothered me. Mm-hmm. And because she said, thank you for not being an angry black man. And I said, why would you think that I'm not, I am an angry black man. And then, she's like, but I know, but you're not effing angry. Like, and she names one of my friends. And so I throw the F word back at her, but I couldn't shake that. Sometimes you have conversations and you just say, that was really weird. And then you're on to the next thing. I couldn't shake that, because I was asking myself, have I become so safe? Like, is that my claim to fame, that I'm the safe, cuddly black guy? Who's lived in the community. I was a Cub Scout. I don't know if I said this at our first meeting, but I delivered Cap Times in the mid-'70s. And so I might have worked for Cap Times before you did.
You did?
Wait a minute. Paul, I certainly worked there before you did, because you were with the Journal for... Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. So I'm the senior guy?
You got seniority at the table.
I wish I had profit sharing, or I wish I had invested, but they didn't let paper boys do that. But I feel that was sort of the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, where I was torn between the insensitivity of what she said, how much pressure it is to be the nice, safe black person that doesn't make people uncomfortable. And then I think my mind went through things that my black colleagues, particularly my black male colleagues, and I talk about. Like if we walk up to a hospital or someplace and there's only one other passenger who's white and female, that we may opt to take the stairs or just say, oh, I forgot something. I jingle my keys when I'm walking in my car, or I'll hit the button so that my lights flash so that it doesn't make someone feel like I'm following them. I think at that moment, being congratulated for being a diminished version of myself, or certainly trying to extrapolate my feelings or my humanity out of that, it kneed me in the groin in a way that I didn't think. And so although we talked about journalism, I think I first needed that pastoral space to voice the fact that that crept up on me. But then I said, it's kind of like this, it's kind of like this line at the end of New Jack City when Wesley Snipes says, basically on the witness stand, if I'm going down, everybody's going down. I'm going to give up names. So I just said, I'm going to tell it. I don't know if you remember my saying that. I was like, I'm going to tell it. The black people might get mad because I'm telling family secrets. The white people might get mad because I'm saying how I feel. But I've got to tell what I'm experiencing.
I know you think you're asking the questions here, but let me ask a question.
Uh-oh. Yes.
I can't help
Once
myself.
a journalist, always a journalist.
I know. So, there's sort of two parts to this. One is part of what gave the article the impact was the picture of you on the cover. You were not a nice, cuddly black man on the cover. You did not look angry, but you looked really serious. I have something to say to you, Madison.
I looked menacing.
And so I'm curious about, from Paul and how that, and the choices for a cover. But then the title for the article created a few ripples, justified anger. How did that come to be? And
I want to know that too, because I did not pick.
pick.
Cap Times doesn't let you pick the name of the article.
Right.
And Paul wasn't there when the photographer came, but I got my butt kicked by the black community
because
they said you're gonna let those white people make you an angry black man, and they're gonna come for you. And so when after the article came out and my arms were folded, because I never posed like that. And then you can see the church in the background. My black friends were like, ooh, you gonna get it? Like, now you had something to say. No one's gonna listen to you. And I think for folks who may not understand this reference, I think the fear was that the community would do a Gene Parks on me. Eugene was a brilliant black politician, first in so many levels, city employee, got in some trouble, had some personal demons, and people could always dismiss his insightful comments by, well, he's angry or he's drinking or he's upset. I think the black community was fearful that all the good that I said would be dismissed because my arms were folded, and then you have anger at the top of the screen. They were really fearful that my voice wouldn't be taken seriously. So I'm curious. Yeah, I was wondering if Paul would tell us. Do you remember who came up with that name? Was that you?
Well, I don't think it was. I think so when you do tabloid covers, tabloid being a smaller version of the broadsheet cover, we're looking for big, impactful words that sort of capture things. And if I recall, several of us got together and we were bandying about call them the big words, and the big words we settled on. With that image of you in that parking lot, with the anecdote in the article about telling the officer what you look like and so forth, right. With that setting, it seemed like that was that when whoever it was in the room who suggested that, we settled on that right away, and then finished the headline with other words. But the description you just gave of having that look and that pose would have never occurred to me, which brings up something that I didn't say earlier, which is, for the last 10 years that I've known you, we've had conversations around all sorts of things, and I'd have to think about them and write them down, but they were sort of like, gee, I never would have thought of that. I've been in Madison 45 years after I got out of graduate school in the Washington, D.C. area, and in Madison, when you're moving here, it's in many ways Shangri-La for white people.
Sure.
You know, it's an educated, affluent, left-leaning community with lots of interesting people, culture, Big Ten sports, the university ecosystem, the whole thing. And so many times over the last 10 years, I've stopped and thought what it must be like to be black in this town. In a way I didn't before we met and before that Justified Anger article appeared. I remember we had an event that actually was a spin-off also of Justified Anger at First Unitarian Society, and we had Keith Woods, who was an editor for the New Orleans Times-Picayune. I think he's in public television or radio in Washington these days, and he oversaw a series there, Together Apart,
Right.
Race in the South. And he was brilliant, and we were talking about crossing the street and just being constantly aware. And it just, time and time again over the last 10 years, there's been instances in which I've thought differently about race in this city as people have left over time for bigger and better jobs. And, I've said many times my observation about the number of people, you included, but many others, who would find life easier in Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Chicago, than they would in Madison.
Definitely.
Make more money, have kids who wouldn't have to worry about their children as much. That whole thing has kind of washed over me multiple times over the years in a way that I don't know that I thought I was aware before, but I became more aware through meeting you and the Justified Anger process.
That's powerful to hear. We made a decision after the article was written to have a town hall meeting because so many people were emailing me and asking my advice, stopping by my office, and I couldn't keep up with all the emails and the responses. So I just said, we'll have a town hall meeting. I didn't know what a town hall meeting was. We threw out a Saturday before Valentine's Day, and our sanctuary holds about 400 people, and we had 100 seats set up for 120 people in the foyer, and people standing up. It was close to 600 people that were out on a really cold day. They parked down the street. They were walking up the hill. It looked like it was the site of a UW Badger football game. Like, it was really crazy. I thought maybe 200 people would show up, with my congregation making up about half of it. I got a call from the police department saying, we heard that you're having a rally, and we want to know if it's all right to put a highway sign or a traffic sign on your property. I said, what are you talking about? How did you hear about this? They said, well, we just got some calls. There's going to be a meeting. We're going to set up satellite parking down the road, at the Villager Mall, and we're going to direct traffic by foot up to your facility. We just want to know, is it okay to put the road sign up there? I thought, what are they talking? This is crazy. Parking lot filled up. People started walking up Badger Road. I almost crapped myself. I thought I was going to come out and just kind of give like a little insight about what was the impetus to the article and what made me write it. And it was a thing. And so a lot of folks were there. Paul, you were in the front row. A lot of your writers were there. One of our state senators showed up. You might remember that. Former police chief Noble Ray came up to me and he says, Alex, I've been doing a little research into this. This is the largest community-based town hall meeting that's ever been called. Like, the police department might have called one, or the university, but in terms of just an individual in the community saying, I want to call a town hall meeting to talk about some things, he said, this is pretty radical. This is pretty exciting. But my head was still swimming because we didn't really have an organizational home for Justified Anger because it was an article. And I can remember Jakisha, who's part of our marketing team for Black Like Me podcast, designed the flyer so that Justified Anger looked like danger. So the D from Justified was red, and so was anger. I got so much feedback because people thought I was calling for a race riot or or some type of uproar, but they thought that I was really trying to incite, not necessarily a riot, but a very rowdy, boisterous gathering. And I remember thinking, you're more concerned about the color of the letters of this gathering, and not the statistics that have us here. And I think that just sort of framed what work would lie ahead of us. You'd have the perception of, what are you saying by just writing danger all in red letters? That's like, why not call a state of emergency? If this happened with any other group, we would. And I think that was just a real big setup for what was going to be happening next and what would be a part of our journey together.
But you decided to adopt that term, justified anger.
The community told me to.
Yeah. And you stayed with it, even though I think some people were saying, what? What's he doing?
Definitely. I think trying to be protective, many Black leaders are just like, Reverend, you're a pastor. You shouldn't be on there looking angry and menacing like that. And I think the fear was either people would come after me or they'd be dismissive of what I had to say. Either way, they thought it was very, it was unfortunate. The other thing was, people from my community said, Cap Times has never done this. They're not serious about this. They're using you. And in about 3 weeks, this is going to be gone. And they're never going to talk about it. You're never going to talk about it. So I don't know why you're all in love with Cap Times and these white folks. Ain't nothing Black over there but the ink. And this is not going to go on. And then I think we're sitting here 10 years later talking about the influence that this has had on Cap Times, on the community, on the Black community, on the broader community. You prove them wrong, but is it fair to ask you, Paul, were they right to be concerned with what they had seen up to that point? Were they right to be concerned? And that's not casting negative light on Cap Times, but I'm just curious about that perception of the Black community about your commitment.
One of the many lines that it was probably from you, it may have been some other experience over time, is that the only time reporters from the Madison dailies went to Black neighborhoods is when there was police tape. And that stuck with me. And I spent 22 decades on the State Journal as a reporter and editor, then was a vice president of the company for a few years before I joined the Capital Times. So I absolutely think they were right to be concerned, and they have a right to continue to be concerned. There's still, you've brought me inside the nuances in the Black community in this town in a way I don't typically get a glance into of the dynamics of Black leadership in town, of generational, gender-based, whatever,
right?
And trying to understand those things. So I continue to try to understand those things, and I continue to think about what we could do, what kind of journalism we can do that will bring things forward, and just do high quality journalism with a larger. With a more open mind about what those stories might entail to get to different places. But I've already said this, but the number of times and the connections I made through you and Justified Anger with people like Darrell Bazell, who went on. He was in a senior position at Bascom at the University of Wisconsin. Now I think he's the chief financial officer of the University of Texas at Austin. Left a number of years ago. But connections like that and an awful lot. It influenced probably my column writing when Noble Ray was police chief, and in a lot of circumstances involving African Americans in town. Sure. So yeah, I think it's a fair concern, and it's a. And I'd understand the feeling about it. And we just need to continue. It's not a one-time thing in which we did this cover. We need to continue to demonstrate our commitment to being open to how we frame stories, whose voices we go to, and how we go forward. Through Justified Anger, I think I made connections with people like Noble, who is really a really powerful voice in this community. Always
in
has
this nation
been.
Now.
Yeah, and Gloria Ladson Billings is another. There are several people like that who I hadn't known well before Justified Anger, who I came to know after, and it's been continuing to have a high impact on me and how I think about what we do.
I think one of the things that has happened with mainstream media in this town, and this, Cap Times, State Journal, TV stations, is up until the last 10, 15 years, this is such an overwhelmingly white community. You think about, who are you pitching your stories to? We're pitching our stories to, well, our white readers. And other people aren't reading, aren't watching, so why are we bothering? And I think that so much misses the texture of the community in which we live, and it just excludes whole bunches of people. And as you say, people notice that and say, well, they're not gonna stay with this. And I think one of the things that the essay did, I think one of the things that Paul and the Cap Times have done over the last decade is say, we need to stay with this. This is important to the whole community. It's certainly important to the individual segments of the community. And I think other media outlets have also been more attentive to that over the last decade than they were back, 20 years ago. There were media and race task forces talking about all this stuff and how can we do a better job. And we heard from the Black community, you don't pay any attention to us. And we said, well, we'll try. We maybe didn't try enough until this really helped change the equation.
And this process reminded me of how important leadership is, too, because after this piece was written, and then there was a huge response to it. Paul, help me, because I may not be remembering the details correctly, but I remember someone from your staff came out to do a story the following Sunday because it was the most read story of that week. But services were canceled because there was an ice storm. I can remember there's only been like 3 times that church services citywide have been canceled where they tell everyone to stay home. So they had to cancel that. By the time that reporter came back, they said it was something like the 11th most read story of the year, and it dropped December 18th. So it wasted like the last 12, 13 days of the year to become like the 11th most read story. So we found that this was really catching some momentum. You fast forward a couple of years, Trump got elected. A lot of media attention was thrown at that, and the community noticed that the issues of race were not talked about as much unless he said something egregious about black people. And I remember having a conversation with you, one of our many meetings at Perkins, Paul, where you were just saying, I've been focusing a lot on political stuff and on Trump, and I've got to help get my troops together and remind them we can't forget about these other local issues as well. Like, what's happening around Trump isn't everything. So I think that helped me to be mindful of the fact, and I think it helped you too to understand that even when you have the right people or good people and they know the right thing to do, leadership has to keep pushing this out in front of folks, because the concern for the Black people was as soon as the next thing came out, we would forget about this. But I think because we had a rapport, I could sit down with Paul and have this discussion. And I think the response to that was, it's been about 5 years since Justified Anger happened. Let's look at what's going on. Let me make sure that I get back in this space, encouraging my team to think about these issues. So for our listeners and folks who are out here, it's not just enough to get the aha. When you're changing systemic thinking and when you're trying to make structural change, you have to keep leading in that way because people follow leadership. Why support Black Like Me podcast? There are very few places where Black activists and innovators can listen to and hear someone so aptly and culturally appropriately voice their concerns and dreams and aspirations and fears and illnesses and cultural commonalities. Equally, there are so few places where concerned non-Black thinkers and feelers, readers and watchers, lovers of culture, stalwarts of racial justice and harmony can go to learn, lean in, and to be a quiet fly on the wall in Black spaces and experience deep personal transformation through listening to honest Black people's truth. Black Like Me podcast is that for so many people in this nation and around the world. Now, while your financial support beginning at as little as $2 a month will get you access to pre-released information, updates, conversations, insights, and exclusive events, your support also affords us the opportunity to expand the quality and reach of our excellent programming in thoughtful and authentic ways to more and more people. And more importantly, white people need to stop trying to get free shit from Black people. All right, seriously, your financial support is a vote of confidence and it's an enabler of vision and innovation. So why not click that link today and join the movement? I want to thank you in advance for your support and your partnership.
The thing I was thinking that's really been something that's resonated with me over the years is the number of times we've talked, and I've observed this in my relationships in the community, that so often people look at you and they see this charismatic pastor and African-American leader, but they don't see your other capabilities, or don't see you in other ways. And we've talked a lot about this, and I've talked to other black leaders about this, is that you're always on, if somebody needs a DEI representative on something, they ask you
free,
in.
free.
Or you're always pigeonholed, may be the wrong term, but pigeonholed as in that space, but we don't think of you in other ways, and that was jolting to me. I don't know if it should have been, because I'd been around a while when we met on Justified Anger, but I think about that a lot when we're thinking about who to write about, how to approach things. That I think it is a distinctive issue in this town with black leaders, that when you think about, I can name 5 or 10, but you think of them, okay, relative to that topic, relative to something going on, Ferguson, George Floyd, whatever it is, as opposed to
easily typecast.
You typecast, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I
I don't know whether Phil has thoughts on that going back further journalistically with the Cap Times and things, but I really have been thinking about that a lot.
Well, let me throw this out. I've been in the nonprofit world 35, 40 years. I probably have raised more money in this community than 99.9% of the population. In 30 years of being a nonprofit exec, sitting on boards, I've never been asked to sit on a finance committee, a business strategy committee, a fundraising committee. I'm always on community relations or diversity.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's been so easy to put people into slots like that. One of my favorite anecdotes you told in your 5-year retrospective about this was the early response you got from some white folks, from people who wanted to be helpful, saying, I'll raise the bail money for you when you go to jail. And you said, wait a minute. Who says I'm going to jail? I need to go to jail if you're going to help me.
That's going to kill my mother. You serious? Like jail? She's like, oh yeah. This is what you got to do. This is like, Yeah. I'm curious, Paul. I'm sure Cap Times got accolades, maybe even national attention around allowing something so gutsy to be written. Did you guys get hate mail or pushback, or did you sense? So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, when we look at the Madison population, who maybe considers itself woke, but not really, what kinds of mumblings and grumblings did you hear in response to this preponderance of black voices showing up in Cap Times saying, this community is not doing us right? So did Cap Times get any pushback? But just in your various circles, outside of your readership, what's your take on how the broader community felt about such a scathing report of Madison's race relations through the eyes of its black homegrown son?
I didn't really get a lot of negative pushback during that period. I think there are a lot of liberals in Madison who consider themselves to be enlightened, woke, whatever, and read with interest. Maybe didn't see, maybe were moved by your perception of the way things are versus their perceptions that things are pretty good here. I will say that I picked up on indications over the years from black leaders, black voices, that we were, as you said earlier, being exploitive or being looking for attention or trying to aggrandize ourselves by doing this, and it came up once or more over time in conversations that again the Capital Times is doing this because you're the flavor of the month, and then they'll move on to something else, and so I got some of that over time.
How do you stay the course, Paul, when you're intentional about being committed to this area of reporting, storytelling, and it doesn't seem to be enough for certain folks?
Mm-hmm.
What keeps you motivated when you feel like, damn, I do this and I'm still suspect among many in the Black community? What keeps you from taking your ball and going home?
Oh, I think Phil knows me real well. We're close old friends, and he knows some of the inside baseball of what it's like to lead a news organization in town, and so it's not unusual to get flack from various people about various things all the time, and so I kind of get used to it. I just know it's the right thing to do, and I just realize how much I think differently than I used to because of these involvements and these connections and so forth. And I try to, in my own column writing, I try to provide frames for understanding how this great mass of liberal, white, affluent people in town has very little interaction with the Black community, because there's not a critical mass really here of African Americans who are in their circles very much. And you mentioned that to me at one point.
I
About
pushed
how,
back hard
yeah,
on that.
When was the last time you had a Black person to your house? And I thought, well, and you can. So then I did something about that and had you to our house with a bunch of other people. Have I done that consistently? Have I followed through on that? No, but I did it once, and so that kind of thing does resonate. But so when I write columns, I try to think about, okay, this is who I'm writing for. This big mass of, I hope it's big, mass of readers who are left-leaning in Madison, who love this community, who empathize in theory with the plight of African Americans in town and try to frame things in that way. Sometimes I succeed, maybe not all the time.
The one thing that I will push back on, and I do this from time to time with you, Paul, is there are more Black people in Wisconsin and Madison than at any time in Wisconsin or Madison history. If you're white, if you're working poor, struggling economically, and you're a Black family, you know white people. They're your teachers, your classmates, your neighbors, your landlords, your social workers. If you're middle class or upper middle class and you're Black, and you don't have social workers, and your peers don't talk to you other than about Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton or something Black, it's very, very lonely. So I also want to say there are Black professionals in this community that are very lonely because they don't get invited to some of the things, because I think white people are afraid of saying something offensive, or that they wouldn't come, or that they're aloof. And so I just want people who are listening to understand some folks have opted to not go out of their way to connect with Black people for a number of reasons. But it's not because they aren't around. It's just some people just don't take the initiatives. I just push that just so that folks will think, if you're a teacher, there are conferences. There are going to be Black teachers. If you're an engineer, there's going to be Black engineers that are there. I think it's easier to find your non-white colleagues in some of these associations. I don't know if people aren't taught how to do it, if they're afraid not to do it. But I found that if Black people aren't just sort of door delivered to certain folks, they will not go across the street or across the aisle or across the hallway to really meet with or engage with Black people because of perceptions that they're only being spoken to because they are Black. And so for listeners who are white and you're in organizations, associations, talk to us, because I show up in places differently now because I'm recognized in this community. But for years you show up and you're new there, and people won't say, hey, is this your first time? Are you new? For fear, I think for fear that they feel like I'm being singled out because I am Black. But I'd rather be singled out and spoken to because I'm Black than ignored because I'm Black. So my friends pushed me again, I'm gonna say this again. They challenged me to be leery, to beware of white journalists. None of your friends warned you all about about talking to me. I mean, nobody said you don't have to give names, but like I'm just trying to see if your friends are better than mine. Like none of your friends said you better watch it. You're talking a lot about that. That's all you talk about. You're gonna lose readers. Like, did anybody tell you to be watchful of going deeper with these kinds of relationships?
I think what I would say about that is that there have been people I've written about, paid a lot of attention to during my years at the Capital Times. You're one of those people, but the others are not black people. They're white people for whom I have a lot of admiration, have done interesting things. I'll pick out. I don't know if she'll ever hear this, but Kathy Kramer, the well-known political scientist.
Sure, she's a friend of mine.
Yeah, about a dozen years ago or so. Somehow I got introduced to her, and I wrote a column about her work on politics of resentment. It was, I think, before the book came out. And I wrote about Kathy and her work more than once. And at some point, I was getting some feedback about, when are you gonna stop writing about Kathy Kramer? She's wonderful, and she got national attention, and she was ahead of the curve on kind of getting at what finally elected Donald Trump 5 years later. So she's brilliant. But I had sort of fully explored the subject with her in multiple columns, and so I got some feedback that way. With you, it would have been kind of the same thing. Like, we've done Justified Anger. You've written columns about him and this subject, and so when is it too much? When is it too much about one person as opposed to it necessarily being around the topic of race? So that's come up, and there are a couple other people who I've written about that people will say, okay, well, obviously, Fanlund will be writing about that person again and again. So it's more that than that it was specifically around race.
Yeah, I think that's something as journalists try and be aware of is if you're on one person or one theme all the time, people no longer read it because I've heard that already. And so how to keep readers engaged is a part of the whole process of journalism. And I think, in the area of racial issues, they're not static. And so there's always new things coming up. But there's also the kind of pushback that, well, why are you doing that again? Didn't we write about that 3 years ago?
Isn't it fixed?
Isn't it fixed?
I guess another thing, and this gets a little bit wonky on journalism, on the craft of journalism, but one of the things I love when we can do these kind of stories are deep dive stories that get at trends, that get at what's really happening, that get at underlying things. One thing I know going on now in South Madison is the rapid escalation of home values and the purchase of them by outside interests that make the dream of entry-level black home ownership more difficult. Now that's a kind of rich, deep, nuanced story that I'd be interested in us going and executing really well. But because we need more people in the communities looking for, listening for, and recognizing trends, as opposed to going to a Juneteenth celebration, which is fine,
right,
for what it is. But I mean, to look for things that we can pull together to help people understand some larger issue that's going on. Those are harder stories to find, and we need help on finding those kind of stories.
Oh, I hear you. As we begin to wrap up this rich conversation, just a couple of things I want to throw out. As senior journalist, you've retired from the field, and Paul, you're focusing, on the foundational work of EVU. And then being the publisher, you brought in an editor-in-chief, is it called? Editor. You brought in an editor to just manage the day-to-day issues. As you step back, what would be your message to young journalists who look like rising stars, who are going to have great platforms? What wisdom or caution would you give them in how they give space, room, or credence to the role of systemic racism in their reporting? What wisdom would you give them, or caution?
Be curious. Make sure you're not always talking to people who look and think like you. Pay attention to the way your community is changing and look at who's being left out so you can bring in their stories. And in part, journalists are storytellers, and whose stories are being left out. So look for those people. There are interesting stories to be told. It's not, but you have to spend time getting to know people. You can't just run in and run out. I think that's one of the things that we've all learned out of the whole justified anger experience. So that'd be my quick thing.
Well, I think that's an excellent summation, and Phil was a great journalist and someone I've admired forever. I guess I don't mean to be repetitive, but that idea of, in addition to all those things about listening and being curious and having an open mind about things, is to look for how things connect with one another. So you find stories that you can, we call it framing, frame the stories to tell stories that then resonate with people and are more meaningful about what's actually happening on the ground, trend-wise, in the community. Things getting better, are they getting worse? How? Why? How do you measure that? Who do you talk to bring that to life? And what is different today versus when we were sitting at Cargo Coffee 10 years ago? That sort of thing.
Do you think Mr. Evu will be proud of this conversation and the space that the Black community has earned and begged for and demanded? No one's come to the Black community and said, carte blanche, sit down with us, we're buying, eat our lunch, tell us what we're not saying, tell us what we're not doing, tell us what we're not forgetting. What do you want your children to go back in the archives and read about you and your endeavors that we're not telling? I'd offer that as a gift. If you did something like that, and if I were asked, I would participate. But I think that there's an appetite for that level of commitment, of really supporting the type of journalism that I think, what I understand about Mr. Evu, what he wanted to do and what he wanted to see and what being progressive really looks like. That would be a very progressive move, because it would not be rooted in the most recent Black-focused riot. It would be really coming to the Black community about our business acumen, our leadership appetite, and just our insight as people who've invested in this community.
Great idea. I look forward to talking about it more.
Sure.
Off air.
And I think the last piece I just offer up is there a segment of or piece of the article that when you read it or reread it, you think this was really pointing towards the future? Like, looking at what we know now about the world post-pandemic, all of the disparities we've witnessed, social determinants of health, is there a piece or a line that you read and think, damn, this was like almost prophetic? Like, were we really listening? And if you can, I'd love it if you have the article handy, if you could read a snippet of that, and you don't have to necessarily elaborate on it, but I would love it if you could read one of those pieces and maybe say why you felt that touched you in a way.
Sure, there was one that hit me when I was rereading it before we got together today, and it's a very short segment, and the words are, your words, I'm not upset because Madison has issues. I'm upset at how Madison skates on many of these issues. I hesitate a bit out of concern my close white friends may misread my anger as being directed at all white people. My anger is with systems, ignorance, insensitivity, prejudiced views, and not with individuals. That was 10 years ago, and think how much we've come to talk about systemic racism. And it's so easy for us fragile white folks to say, oh my gosh, he's mad at me. And what you were saying in this article and what you've been saying since then is there are systems that need to be dealt with.
Right.
We need to pay attention to that. We as white folks have to kind of get past ourselves to say, yeah, there's a system here. But I think that those couple of sentences really caught me.
Powerful.
You know what I'm going to go a little bit different direction and say that I was looking at the article too, and Phil may have stolen my thunder, because if you knew the terminology of journalism, that is sort of a nut graph. That was a kind of a nut graph of the nut of the whole message in Justified Anger. I guess what I'd say is something that hasn't come out today that I think is so remarkable is how out of Justified Anger came the history classes that we were celebrating with you at the Barrymore a couple of weeks ago, and how incredibly timely they were in that whole process. And what you said, 5,000 people have gone through those classes,
5,000.
And then how in the last 3 or 4 years, white America many in white America don't want to make people feel bad about knowing what history is really. I mean,
it's
couldn't
illegal
have been
in some
more.
places.
Yeah, I mean, the juxtaposition of that effort out of Justified Anger, to me, is maybe the biggest thing of all. Is that you were out in front of that and doing that with history before it became the third rail, in national politics, and it's just so remarkable where we are today with people's intolerance for knowing our own history.
Well, I feel that for both of those responses, it was quite the mic drop. I really appreciate your time here today talking with me, but more importantly, Phil, I really appreciate the fact that you connected me with Paul. And Paul, I'm happy that we've had interactions that weren't around articles and journalism, but plenty that were. And the honest conversations that we've had on the record and off the record have helped me to be able to reflect on what I can contribute to this community and what I'm supposed to give to the community. So I feel very fortunate to be in relationship with each of you, and appreciate the fact that what started out as a good idea from you and a coffee has us still sitting here, and thousands of people, if not tens of thousands of people, are benefiting from the relationship. So thank you all so much. And I'm looking forward to just more aspects of how we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of this cover story, this essay, Justified Anger. So my special guests who've been in the studio with me today, again, has been Paul Fanlund, the publisher of Cap Times, and Phil Halsinger, the retired journalist, retired yet redeployed pastor in our community, and good friend. I really appreciate them. And I appreciate you all, the supporters of Black Like Me, our patron supporters who make sure that this podcast continues, and all of the listeners. Thank you for posting and reposting and writing comments and going to various places and writing about how you feel about this podcast and sharing it with your friend. I do this so that we can continue to help you to listen, learn, lead in, and become a part of the change that we all want to see. So have a great day, and thank you for being the best part of Black Like Me podcast.
Black Like Me. Black Like Me.
I want to thank you for taking time to listen to this episode of Black Like Me podcast with Dr. Alex G. You know, when I first imagined doing this podcast, I thought about myself with my iPhone sitting in a room in my house, just sort of doing this all on my own. But you know what? The reason why we've won awards and the reason why we have over 200 episodes up is because I have a brilliant team who helps me to make this podcast what it is. So let me take a moment and thank Jeremy and Eli, who are my editors and producers extraordinaire, Jakisha, who handles marketing. If you like that opening track of our theme song, you can show your appreciation to Corey Saffold, who created that and produced it, and Marcus Fleming, my cousin, who's on vocals. I also want to say that this podcast was started with the generous support of the Human Family Unity Foundation, and so we always want to stop and thank them for that. For the many patrons who support us through our Patreon page, thank you, thank you, thank you. You don't just listen, but you support, you lean in, and you help this podcast to be what it is. And then I need to thank you, the listeners, who make a point of downloading this, listening to it, and sharing it. Without all of you, this podcast would not be what it is and what it's becoming. Thank you so much.
Black Like Me.